Alright, back in the backyard, answering ink questions part 1. Sassy Hobbies asks, are pink inks difficult to create? Yes, pink inks can be very difficult to create. Pinks and reds oftentimes don't mix as linearly as you think. When we think about color theory and mixing colors, we think that you add, red and blue and you get purple, you add blue and yellow, you get green, but sometimes the color that you're aiming for is not exactly the color that comes out. It's not exactly a 1 plus 1 equals 2, and the red and pink side of things is sometimes the harder ones to guess. Hello Tello Studio, I guess that's John Tello asks, hi John, are you going to make a waterproof ink at some point? There's two ways. The short answer, no, I'm probably not. There's two ways to make waterproof inks. One of them is like the old-timey iron gall ink, which chemically changes and creates a larger molecule that's not soluble in water once it's exposed to the oxygen and atmosphere. So making an ink that has a chemical change when it's in the bottle versus out of the bottle, or when the water in that dries, is one way. The other way to do it is the way that like a Sharpie marker works, which is to use a dye that is not water soluble at all, but is soluble in another carrier liquid like alcohol, which is how Sharpies do it. They use an alcohol that doesn't have a smell, or an unobtrusive smell. And I just don't like working with either of those chemicals. My kids help out at the lab sometimes, and I prefer to use safer chemicals, and I just don't really like working with that stuff. There are plenty of good waterproof inks on the market, and I hope you guys find some that work. All right, Kit Snaps ask, what gives an ink great shading characteristics? A few people asked about ink shading and why inks shade. The reason inks shade has to do with the hysteretics of the liquid as it sits on the paper. You can imagine if you have a drop of liquid fall on a car windshield with a lot of Rain-X and it sits as a very round ball, versus if you take your finger and you smear out a drop of liquid, it gets flatter at the edge. So the shape of that meniscus of the water on the paper, as scribed out by the nib of the pen, will have more or less of an arc, and that arc will absorb into the paper differently with different fiber lengths and absorbency of papers, and with different chemical compositions of the ink. As that meniscus dries down and flattens out, you'll end up with different concentrations of dyes and all of the chemicals in the ink near the edges as towards the center. This is why if you have a raindrop and it dries, it leaves like a ring of, or if you have like a hard water droplet, will leave a ring around where the droplet was and not be uniform in consistency, is because as that droplet is drying down, you're changing the concentration subtly, and you end up with different concentrations at the edge than as compared to the center. So that's why shading inks shade the way they do. Can you control it? Yeah, a little bit, but there's a lot of chemicals interacting, and the different pen types and paper types make so many variables that it's one of those happy accidents that we just sort of live with. All right. What causes, Layla Might Write asks, what properties of ink cause sheen? And do you have a favorite ink you've created? I do have a favorite ink. It's the blue that I'm about to announce in like a little bit. It's the Fish Series blue. Ink sheening is caused by the inks. Some inks, when they get absorbed into the fibers of paper or not, some of them lay on top of the paper. The dye lays on top of the paper as a residue. And when it does that, it can crystallize out and form what's called structural color. Sometimes you see the color of the dye itself is different in a powder form than in a liquid form. You can have a dye that looks red when it's a powder and you put it in water and it turns blue, which is quite bizarre. So if that dries out on the surface of the paper, you can see the sort of crystal structure of the dye, and you can see some of that redness, and you might still see it as blue once it absorbs in. So especially if you have ink that has multiple dyes, you can sheen with one single color because the dyes are interacting with the cellulose fibers of the paper differently, or sort of settling on the surface of the paper and causing that kind of crystalline structure. That's why it has that iridescent kind of sheen to it. So you can either get what's called structural color, which is made by the size of the surface of the crystals absorbing or reflecting light in different ways, sort of like how the bottom of a CD shows rainbow colors. It's a diffraction grid in that case, but it's the same basic principle, versus the dyes that got absorbed into the fibers. Ink Dependence asked, I'd love to know what sort of biocide you use and how you picked it. I'm not going to say specific ingredients because it's trade secrets, but I'll tell you there are biocides which are preservatives, are used in virtually all manufactured products that have a liquid component, because microbes use water as part of their metabolism. Dry things don't typically need biocides. So everything from food products and harsher chemicals will have something that keeps fungi and bacteria from growing in them. The food products that use biocides either use aspects of food themselves. For example, the carbonation in soda acts as a biocide when the soda is closed. If you open a can of soda, it will eventually grow stuff in it, which is gross. But the carbonation, it acts as a biocide, or the capsaicin in hot sauce acts as a biocide. Some foods don't have an adequate concentration of naturally occurring biocides, so they add some preservatives which are edible. Usually they're salts. Usually they're sodium and potassium salts, and you find those at the end of ingredients labels. And I have made inks in the past that use entirely food-safe ingredients, and just like foods, they don't have as long of a shelf life as products that you aren't supposed to eat, like shampoo, for example. There are chemicals that are much more resistant to bacterial and fungal growth, like some strong solvents. Some very old inks, you imagine inks made in the 50s and 60s might have used, something like some turpentine derivative that was carcinogenic to touch, but was extremely effective at killing fungi and bacteria. So those are kind of on the higher end of toxicity, and I don't use those either. So I have chose biocides which are safe, but effective enough to have a multi-year shelf life. All right. BJ Smith asks, I'd love to know, at what point did you decide to make ink? I love the idea behind it, and it intrigues me so much. I was a graduate student pursuing a doctoral degree, which I ultimately dropped out of after passing my candidacy exams. And I was pursuing a doctorate degree in biogeochemistry, which gave me access to a really cool chemistry lab. And I was doing a lot of thinking about the chemicals that make things up and playing around with what the chemicals are that compose the soda and coffee that you drink and the food that you eat. And I was a fountain pen user, so naturally I looked into the chemicals that compose fountain pen ink. And I actually made my own colors because I liked them. And after a while, I just started bottling them and selling them. Excellent question. Thanks for that. I dip bananas into coffee asks me, do you dip bananas into your ink? Well, no. 1003 Inks asks, would you consider making an echinoderm-themed ink series? I think it would be amazing. I think that would be amazing, too. For those of you who don't know, echinoderms it's a word that means spiky skin, and those are the asteroids, the sea stars, the echinoids, the urchins, the crinoids, which are like the sea feathers, and the basket stars and those kinds of weird things, and some other oddballs like sea cucumbers and stuff, which are some of just the weirdest, most alien critters roaming around the oceans. And yeah, they're neat. I don't have plans to make that. I think there's a couple other groups of organisms that are pretty cool too. I like the idea. I will keep it in the back of my mind. The Collector's Pen asks, I bought a major brand pen and it came with a bottle of ink and it says mixable. So is it generally not meant to be mixed? Is it a bad idea to mix different brands? For the most part, all modern inks are going to be relatively compatible with each other so long as they're in the same sort of category, which would be like non-waterproof inks. You're going to have trouble if you mix waterproof and non-waterproof inks. But for the most part, pretty much every modern ink, if it doesn't have a really weird smell, if it's not waterproof, if it's relatively modern, you're going to be able to mix it with other stuff, which is a great way to invent new colors. I think there's a subreddit for mixing inks, fountain pen inks. Oh, I lost my spot. All right. Subtle Variegation asks, when you create your ink, do you have a name first and make the color, or do you make the color and then find a suitable name for it? What an excellent question. It's a little bit of both. I sort of know, like making the Avian series, I knew I wanted a pink, right? So I had the color, I knew what the color was going to be, but I also sort of knew I wasn't going to do a flamingo, and roseate spoonbill was a local bird, so that kind of falls into place. On the other hand, there are some animals which are just so fantastic that it's like, I would really like to include this animal. What would be a color that is going to suit it well, or how can I sort of match these together? So it's a little bit of both. Quirky Girl Plans asks about shading. I think I covered that pretty well. How'd you start making the ink? I think I covered that. I would like to know. So Florida 4 asks, I would love to know if you keep precise formulas so that the ink pigment dyes saturation, viscosity, and lubrication levels are reproducible every time. Yes, Florida 4, I do. I'm very stringent with my formulas. So my margin of error, my acceptable margin of error is plus or minus 5 hundredths of a gram on my ingredients, which means if I make a batch, usually about 5 liters, I'm in 1 part per 50,000 margin of error, which means that my margin of error is probably, there's error on everything that's made in all products. There's variability between every can of Coke, between every batch of, Chick-fil-A French fries, between every product that's ever made has variability between one thing and the next. We just try and shoot for having that variability be low enough that it isn't noticeable or matters. And I try and make my precision low enough that variability in things like the ingredients that I buy have variability in them, and things like even just ingredients that are both liquid and dry ingredients will absorb moisture from the air, and that can change their chemical composition, the age that those ingredients were, the purity that they were when I bought them. All of those things are going to contribute to variable products. It's just the nature of the beast. But I shoot for about 1 part in 50,000 error. Judo Gibbs asks, how long are your inks stable for? I've often wondered for a neutral pH ink with a wider mouth shards, let's say more particulates that spoil it quicker versus a standard narrow opening bottle. So I believe that I keep test batches of old, or I keep test bottles of old batches, and open bottles that are, 4, 5, 6 years old, and they're quite fine, which is what I expect. I also hear from customers who have inks that have gone bad and got bacterial growth in 18 months. It is a liquid product with carbon-based compounds stored at room temperature that will just be susceptible to bacterial growth eventually. I don't believe that what's called flocculation, which are particulates that settle out of the air, I don't believe that flocculate particulates are the main cause of contamination for fountain pen inks. I believe that it is cross-contamination from using the pen as a fulmite, where we've touched with our hands the pen, and then the pen goes into the ink. I believe that's the main driver of contamination. Even if you have clean hands, everyone has germs on their hands, and unless you're like a surgeon scrubbing up for surgery or something. So I believe it actually comes from the pens themselves. I don't know of anyone who's done a study on whether wide mouth versus narrow store for longer. But the answer for how long are they stable for is it really depends on how much contamination they're exposed to. Maybe someone sneezes on their hand or sneezes in there, or they touch something and it gets on their pen and it goes bad in 18 months. Maybe it lasts for 20 years. Who knows? Will bottle holders be available at shows? I usually have a couple. Stop by and ask, or send me a message and say you want one, and I'll bring one to a show if you're going to it. What's the process to make a super sheening ink? And why do they say that ink is not safe for fountain pens? The super sheening ink is choosing the ingredients that have that crystallization property. I think some people supplement the sheen with some shimmery inks, which are like tiny little bits of plastic. Those can clog up the feed in fountain pens, so they can be difficult to clean out because they're not actually dissolved in the water, so they just get stuck places. The Planner Journey asks, are certain ink colors harder to make than others? Yes, certain ink colors are harder to make than others. I particularly like working with inks because of the nonlinearity of it. There's a lot of the colors that we see, unless you have a lot of the colors, like if you know what a Pantone graph is or Pantone chart, those are one color, one true spectral color, one frequency of light. And a lot of inks are made with multiple dyes, and those are composite colors, and we see those composite colors in really unique ways. And so some colors like browns and greens especially, our eyes are most able to see the most variety and shades of green of any color. And so you can approach colors that are composite colors from multiple different ways. There are colors which look virtually identical to some people and look very different. You know, these two inks might look the same to you, and to someone else they might look very different. Because you can approach those composite colors from different sort of pairs of dyes or combinations of dyes, and working towards a color from different directions sometimes goes askew and ends up in a little different direction, and you have to sort of take a step back and come at it from a different way. So there are different difficulties. Some are much easier than others. Love the bottle holders. Making pink ink difficult. Which ink color is the easiest? Yeah, there are different difficulties. I kind of don't want to get into which ones are easy versus hard. You guys can probably, the more nuanced and complex the colors are, usually the more difficult it is, and the reds tend to be more difficult. Benevolent Corvus asks, will you eventually make a line of pigment inks? I do plan on making a line of pigment inks. It will be a dip pen line of inks that I will make in the future. Is the Vizcaya green light fast? Yes, all the inks that I use are reasonably light fast with indoor lighting. Everything fades in the sun, but with direct sunlight, especially here in Florida. But with indoor lighting, they should be light fast for a decade or more. Will you ever make any shimmer inks? Donna OBX asks. No, I won't. For one, I don't like working with the material. It's like a microscopic glitter. I have worked with it in the past, and I looked like a sparkly vampire for days afterwards. And for two, they are actually just microplastics, and I don't really like. I don't like working with it, but I also just don't like having that as an ingredient in a product that I make or is out there. So no shimmer inks. There are plenty of good ones on the market. I hope you find some that you like. How do you seek inspiration for your next color line? am a biologist by training and really like nature, and there are so many groups of organisms that I particularly like, and I talk with my friends and family about, hey, wouldn't it be cool to do like a Coleoptera one? And they go, Coleoptera, what's that? And I go, beetles. Wouldn't we, like, let's do a beetles line? And they're like, beetles are gross, don't do bugs. So, it's a lot of that kind of stuff. um, I have about 10 ideas in my head to make. So I'm not ever short on inspiration. I'm short on ideas that will translate into good products. Vic Moore asks, what are some interesting things to add to ink and what purpose do they serve? So I'm not going to talk details about the ingredients in my specific ink, but I will tell you about things that are added to products in general. There are odorants, which people add. There are inks that make smells. There are scented inks. I don't particularly like those. A lot of the reason why those don't work well is most odorants are non-polar molecules that wouldn't dissolve in water, so that's why it's like essential oils for aromatherapies. There are surfactants, which are surface acting agents which change surface tension of liquids, which is important for something like a fountain pen because the feed in a fountain pen relies on surface tension to function. So modifying surface tension, increasing or decreasing it, is an issue. There are chemicals that you can add that change viscosity. There are chemicals that you can add that change how fast or slow something evaporates, which is kind of a cool property. There are chemicals that you can add that cause other chemicals to dissolve more or less readily, called commiscibility, where something might not be very soluble unless you add another chemical with it, or does the opposite, where it reduces the solubility and causes those chemicals to precipitate out of solution. Um, all of those are all of those are possible, and some variant of them are used in some variant of inks, mine and others. Where do you source ingredients for your inks, dyes, additives? Have you ever synthesized one chemically? I have synthesized ingredients chemically. It is tedious, and I just purchase my ingredients from chemical supply companies. Can there be a pink shading for MK with green tones? Probably. There are many more dyes that are available. There are many more colored chemicals than dyes that are commercially available. And it would likely be possible to make many more combinations than we see as commercially available inks, but they would have some problem with light fastness or solubility or toxicity or some other kind of issue that precludes them from being commercially viable inks. So while it might be possible, there might be good reasons why we haven't seen them. Rorschach Doodles asks, why do some inks drag or seem dry when writing with them? They drag because the ink maker has either not added... I'm going to make the assumption that all of the ink makers understand the chemistry of what's in their ink and say they have chosen to tailor the flow properties of their ink to a pen that has a much wetter feed than what you're used to. That means with your pen and your paper, it just requires a little bit more of those flow modulators. I used to sell a bottled ink wetter. There's other companies now that make similar products, and you can get those and add it to your inks, and it will flow better, hopefully. Do all your inks start with the same ingredients, or do the different colors and characteristics change the recipe? The recipes change. They are all unique and beautiful butterflies. What are your opinions on mixing different inks together? I think it is fantastic. I love seeing when people mix inks and come up with something cool, and especially something unexpected. If you guys ever mix inks, whether they're mine or other people's, and you post it on Instagram, tag me. I want to see that. That's really cool. I love seeing that kind of stuff. The Ink Witch asks what got you into making inks. I think I covered that. I appreciate that you don't have weird jars. I guess weird is could be interpreted in different ways. Some people think they're weird. What's different in fountain pen ink and dip pen ink? Good question. For those of you who don't know, dip pen ink often has pigments in it that are particulates that would get clogged in the feed of a fountain pen, so you just use dye-based inks in fountain pens. You can use both in a dip pen, though. What inspired you to become an ink producer? I think I covered that pretty well. Why are you not making any more of that particular ink? That particular ink was made for the Miami Pen Show for the 2024. It's a special edition. We've made a bunch of special edition inks for particular pen shows. We do one every year for Chicago. And I like the exclusivity of making an ink that's never going to be made anymore. And, it comes and goes. It is what it is. We have our regular lines, and there's something sort of poetic about sandcastles. They were there. Someone put some craft into making them, and they're not there anymore. And once all that ink is used up, I hope the drawings that you made with it and the poems that you wrote with it endure, but the ink will not. So, your roseate spoonbill pink exists. Why would anyone ever need another bottle of pink ink? Excellent question. I don't know that they would. Although rosy maple pink is a little bit softer if you like that kind of thing. What is an ink that you want to make but haven't yet? I'm really excited to do some pigmented stuff. I want to do some cool calligraphy stuff for pigmented inks. I haven't worked much on that at this point. What are the basics to get ink to shade? How are shading inks created? I think I've covered that reasonably well. If I haven't, ask again and I'll reiterate it. As you can tell, I love to ramble about this kind of stuff. Are your inks mixable? Yes, they are. No question, just love your ink. Well, thank you, Magnolia Pen Company. What gives an ink great shading? Are these looping back? Seems like I've looped back on the same questions again. What was the color of the first ink you made? It was close to Flying Squid Blue. I modified it to be Flying Squid. What eventually became Flying Squid Blue was very similar to the first ink that I ever made. All right, I think that brings me to the end of the public comments. This is probably as long of an Instagram video as anyone will ever watch. If you got to the end of it, thank you. If I didn't explain something well, ask again. I'll give another day or two for more people to post questions, and then I will pick a winner at random and send them a bottle of Vizcaya ink. If you want to buy a Vizcaya ink, shoot me a private message and I'll send you a link to buy one. All right, guys, take care.